Alexander Rivers had spent his entire life believing he was alone. No family, no attachments, nothing to hold him back from building his empire. He had convinced himself that success was all that mattered, that there was nothing missing from his carefully constructed world. But all of that changed the moment a little girl with familiar blue eyes grabbed his sleeve in a hospital hallway and whispered, "Please, help my mom." He could have ignored it, could have walked away and continued living in the illusion that his past was buried. But then she said a name, Catherine Brooks, And in that instant, his entire world came crashing down. Alexander Rivers had spent years perfecting the art of control. As the CEO of one of the most successful hospitality empires in the country, he had built his career on discipline, precision, and an unwavering focus on success. He had no time for distractions, no patience for anything that didn't serve his long-term goals. He had structured his life in a way that left little room for anything personal, and he preferred it that way. Business was predictable. People were not. That afternoon, he found himself at the hospital, a place he rarely visited unless it was a necessity. One of his senior managers had been in a car accident, and although the injuries weren't life-threatening, Alexander felt obligated to check in. He wasn't sentimental, but he believed in loyalty. His employees were the backbone of his empire, and while he wasn't the kind of man to make small talk or send flowers, he made sure his people knew he had their back. He had just finished speaking with the doctor when he turned to leave, already calculating how much time he had lost from his schedule. That was when he heard the voice. "Please, help my mom." He stopped mid-step, turning toward the sound. A young girl stood a few feet away, looking up at him with wide, desperate blue eyes. She couldn't have been older than 10, her small frame tense as she clutched the fabric of her jacket with tiny fists. Her face was pale, her expression pleading. Alexander frowned. He wasn't used to children approaching him, especially not in a hospital. For a brief moment, he assumed she had mistaken him for someone else. But she wasn't looking around in confusion or searching for another adult. She was looking directly at him. "Who is your mother?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. The girl swallowed hard, her lips trembling slightly before she spoke. "Her name is Catherine Brooks." Everything around him seemed to pause. His breath hitched, his body stiffened, and for the first time in a long time, his mind went completely blank. That was a name he hadn't heard in over a decade. A name that belonged to someone he had once known well, someone he had once cared for more than he had admitted, even to himself. The weight of it hit him unexpectedly, pulling him back to a past he had long buried. His chest tightened as he forced himself to focus. It had to be a coincidence. There were plenty of women with that name. But something in the way this girl looked at him, something familiar, something unsettling, made him question everything. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice quieter now, laced with something even he couldn't define. The girl hesitated only for a second before she reached out, gripping his sleeve as if afraid he would disappear. "Please, you have to help her," she whispered. "She's really sick." Alexander felt a strange sensation settle over him, something between dread and urgency. He didn't know what he would find when he walked into that hospital room, but something told him that whatever it was, his life was about to change in ways he never could have anticipated. Without another word, he nodded and followed the girl down the hallway. As Alexander followed the girl down the stark white hospital hallway, he felt an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. He wasn't a man prone to emotion, nor was he someone who dwelled on the past, but hearing Catherine's name had shaken something loose inside him. He kept his steps measured, his face unreadable, but inside, questions swirled faster than he could process them. The girl, small but determined, walked ahead of him with a purpose that didn't belong to someone her age. She held onto his sleeve tightly, as if she was afraid he might disappear. There was something eerily familiar about her, the shape of her face, the way her lips pressed together when she was nervous, even the sharpness in her blue eyes. He had seen that expression before, but he couldn't yet place where. They reached a room near the end of the hallway, and the girl finally released his sleeve. She hesitated, her fingers lingering near the door handle before she turned to face him. "She doesn't know I went looking for help," she admitted, her voice quiet. "She doesn't like asking for things." Alexander clenched his jaw, recognizing that trait all too well. He gave her a short nod, then watched as she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The moment he entered the room, time seemed to slow. Catherine Brooks lay in the hospital bed, her once vibrant presence dimmed by exhaustion. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, her skin paler than he remembered, but even in her weakened state, she was still unmistakably her. She had barely changed, and yet, everything about the moment felt different. She looked fragile in a way he had never seen before. For a moment, he could do nothing but stare. Memories that had been locked away for years surged forward with an intensity he wasn't prepared for. Then, as if sensing his presence, Catherine slowly turned her head. Their eyes met, and the air in the room grew thick with everything unspoken between them. "Alex," she breathed, disbelief flickering across her face. His name on her lips sent an unexpected jolt through him. He had imagined running into her again under different circumstances, maybe in passing, maybe in another lifetime. But never like this. Never with a child, her child, standing between them, looking up at both of them with a mix of hope and uncertainty. He stepped forward, his voice controlled but laced with something unreadable. "What happened to you?" Catherine exhaled slowly, as if even speaking required effort. "Life happened." The girl, still standing at the side of the bed, placed a small hand on her mother's arm. "I brought someone to help, Mom," she said softly. "I brought him." Catherine's gaze flickered to her daughter before returning to Alexander. Something unreadable passed through her expression: shock, hesitation, regret. "I didn't expect to see you again," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect to be here," he replied. "But it seems a lot of things have happened that I wasn't aware of." Catherine's fingers curled slightly against the blanket, her body tense in a way that told him she was bracing herself. Alexander exhaled, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "Tell me the truth. What's going on?" Catherine hesitated, and for a moment, he thought she might refuse to answer. But then, she closed her eyes briefly before speaking. "I have a heart condition," she finally admitted. "It's gotten worse. The doctors say I need surgery, but you didn't tell anyone," Alexander finished, his voice sharper than he intended. Catherine looked away. "It's not that simple." The frustration building inside him was hard to contain. He had spent years ensuring that people who worked for him, people who barely knew him, never had to go through hardships alone. And yet, the one person he had once loved had chosen to face this battle without anyone by her side. Before he could say anything else, the girl spoke up again. "Mom, I didn't know what else to do," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I didn't want to lose you." Alexander turned to the child again, watching as she gripped the fabric of her mother's hospital gown, holding on as if she could keep her safe just by being close. Something in his chest tightened. Catherine's eyes softened as she reached out, brushing a hand through the girl's light brown hair. "Sophia, sweetheart, I told you not to worry." "Sophia." Alexander's head snapped up at the name, realization crashing over him like a wave. He looked at Catherine, his voice quiet but demanding. "Who is she?" Catherine's hand stilled. Sophia turned her head slightly, confusion flickering in her blue eyes. "She's my daughter," Catherine answered carefully. The air felt like it had been sucked from the room. He swallowed hard, his mind racing, piecing together what should have been obvious the moment he walked in. He turned back to Sophia, studying her with a new understanding. His voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke. "She's my daughter, isn't she?" Catherine didn't answer right away. Her lips parted, but no words came. Then, finally, she gave the smallest nod. Yes, Alex, she admitted. She's yours. Alexander felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. His mind struggled to keep up with what he had just heard. The girl standing between him and Catherine, this small, frightened child, was his daughter. The weight of that truth hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over years of certainty and leaving him drowning in a sea of questions. He turned to look at Sophia again, really looked at her this time. The resemblance was undeniable. Her blue eyes, the shape of her face, even the way she carried herself with a quiet kind of determination, these were things he had seen in himself for years. How had he not realized it the moment he walked into the room? His throat felt tight as he turned back to Catherine, his voice coming out lower than he intended. How long have you kept this from me? Catherine's fingers tensed against the blanket, guilt flickering across her face. I never planned to, she admitted. I was scared. By the time I found out I was pregnant, you were already gone. You were building your empire, making something of yourself, and she stopped, exhaling shakily. I didn't want to hold you back, Alex. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His entire life had been built around control, around making decisions that shaped his future, yet here he was, learning that one of the most important choices had been taken from him without his knowledge. You should have told me, he said, his voice rougher than before. You had no right to make that decision for me. Catherine flinched, but she didn't look away. I know, she whispered. But back then, I thought I was doing the right thing. You were on the edge of something great, and I told myself that if I reached out, it would only complicate things for you. Anger, hurt, and something far more complicated churned inside him. So you decided I didn't need to know. I decided that I didn't want Sophia to grow up thinking she was someone's mistake, Catherine said, her voice suddenly sharper. I knew you, Alex. I knew that if I told you, you would have dropped everything. And I didn't want to be the reason you resented us. Alexander clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. He wanted to argue, to tell her she had been wrong, but a part of him, the part that had spent years prioritizing business over everything else, knew there was some truth in her words. He had been ruthless in his pursuit of success. If he had known back then, would he have been the father Sophia needed? The thought made his stomach turn. He looked at Sophia again. She was watching them both carefully, her small hands gripping the edge of her mother's blanket. She was old enough to understand that something big was happening, but young enough that the full weight of it hadn't settled on her yet. I'm sorry, Catherine said, her voice quieter now. I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know how to do it differently. Alexander exhaled slowly, trying to push past the storm raging inside him. Does she know? Catherine hesitated before shaking her head. She knows about you. She knows your name, that you're successful, that I once cared about you. But she never knew the full truth. Not until now. Alexander nodded stiffly, turning back to Sophia. His heart pounded in his chest as he knelt down to her level, suddenly feeling like a stranger in his own life. Sophia, he said gently. Do you understand what we're talking about? The girl hesitated, glancing at her mother before looking back at him. You're my dad, she said softly, as if testing the words. Alexander's breath caught. Hearing it aloud made it more real than anything else had. He swallowed past the lump in his throat, forcing himself to hold her gaze. Yes, he said. I am. Sophia studied him, her expression unreadable. Are you staying? The simplicity of the question nearly broke him. He had spent years making promises to business partners, investors, and shareholders, but never to someone who truly needed him. This was different. This mattered in a way he had never experienced before. He didn't hesitate. Yes, he said firmly. I'm staying. Sophia's eyes flickered with something uncertain, but then, slowly, she nodded. Catherine watched them both, her expression unreadable. "What happens now?" she asked. Alexander didn't have all the answers, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to walk away. "We figure it out," he said. "Together." Alexander had spent years mastering control, but sitting in Catherine's hospital room with the weight of everything he had just learned, he felt like he was grasping at something just out of reach. The world he had built, the life he had carefully structured, had changed in an instant. He had a daughter. An entire decade of her life had passed without him even knowing she existed. The realization was overwhelming, but there was no time to dwell on his emotions. Right now, there were bigger concerns. Catherine was still too weak to sit up for long, and Sophia had curled up in the chair beside her, exhaustion settling in after the emotional weight of the conversation. Alexander remained standing, hands in his pockets, his mind moving a mile a minute. The business side of him had already switched into problem-solving mode, assessing what needed to be done. Catherine needed proper medical care, and if the doctors were saying surgery was necessary, he wasn't going to waste another second. "What's the next step?" he asked, his voice even but firm. Catherine blinked at him, as if not expecting the question. "What do you mean?" "For your treatment," he clarified. "I assume there's a plan." She exhaled, her gaze dropping to her hands. "The doctors want to schedule surgery within the next few weeks, but I was waiting on approval. I don't have the best insurance, and I've already used most of my savings on treatments to manage the symptoms." Alexander's jaw tightened. The thought of her struggling through this alone, worrying about finances on top of everything else, sent a sharp wave of frustration through him. "That's not a concern anymore," he said, pulling his phone from his pocket. "You're getting the best care available. I'll handle the costs." Catherine tensed, her expression immediately shifting into one of resistance. "Alex, no. I didn't tell you about Sophia to ask for money." He looked at her sharply. "I don't care why you told me. The fact is, I know now. And I'm not going to stand by while you risk your life because you're too proud to accept help." She looked torn, glancing at Sophia as if she didn't want to have this argument in front of her. Alexander followed her gaze, noticing how peaceful the little girl looked despite the tension in the room. He lowered his voice, stepping closer to Catherine. "I know you're used to handling everything on your own," he said. "But you don't have to anymore. Whether you like it or not, I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." She searched his face, something unreadable in her expression. For a moment, it looked like she wanted to fight him on this, to insist she could manage on her own. But then, slowly, the tension in her shoulders eased. "Fine," she murmured. "But only if you let me pay you back when I can." Alexander let out a slow breath, knowing this was the best compromise he was going to get. "Deal." Catherine looked down at Sophia again, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "She's been so strong through all of this," she said softly. "Too strong for her age." Alexander studied his daughter, the word still foreign in his mind. He had spent years closing himself off from attachments, convincing himself that he was better off alone. But seeing Sophia now, knowing she had been out there all this time, changed something inside him. "She shouldn't have had to be," he admitted. "That's going to change." Catherine sighed, leaning her head back against the pillow. "She'll need time, Alex. You can't just step in and expect everything to fall into place overnight." "I don't," he said. "But I can't ignore the fact that I've already missed too much time. I need to figure out how to make up for it." Catherine smiled faintly, exhaustion creeping into her features. "You're already doing more than I ever expected." He didn't know how to respond to that. Part of him was still grappling with the fact that he had been left out of Sophia's life for so long, but another part of him understood. He had been a different man back then, driven only by ambition. Would he have been ready for fatherhood if Catherine had told him? He wasn't sure. But he was sure of one thing now. He wasn't going to miss another moment. As the room settled into silence, he pulled out his phone and made a few calls. By morning, the best doctors in the state would be reviewing Catherine's case, and arrangements would be made for the surgery. He had spent his life building a legacy through business, but none of it had ever felt as important as what he was doing now. He had always believed success was measured in power and achievement. But for the first time, he was starting to realize it was measured in something much greater. The following days passed in a blur of phone calls, medical appointments, and logistical arrangements. Alexander had wasted no time in pulling every string necessary to ensure Catherine received the best care possible. Within hours of making his first call, her case had been assigned to one of the top surgeons in the state. The operation was scheduled for the following week, and he had personally ensured that every aspect of her hospital stay would be covered, regardless of cost. Despite her initial resistance, Catherine had eventually relented, though he could see the struggle in her eyes every time another plan was put into place. She wasn't used to relying on anyone, and it was clear that the idea of accepting help, especially from him, was difficult. But she also knew she didn't have the luxury of refusing. Sophia needed her, and for that reason alone, she let him take control. Alexander had never been one to linger in hospitals, but now he found himself spending more time there than anywhere else. Every evening, after work, he stopped by to check on Catherine and spend time with Sophia. The first few visits had been awkward. Sophia, despite her initial desperation to help her mother, wasn't entirely sure how to act around him now that she knew who he was. She was polite, but cautious, as if unsure whether he was really going to stay. It frustrated him, not because he expected immediate acceptance, but because he knew that was a result of the years he had missed. He had always prided himself on being a man who could fix any situation, but this was different. This wasn't a business deal he could negotiate or a problem he could solve overnight. This was a relationship, fragile and uncertain, and for once, he had to learn patience. One evening, he arrived at the hospital later than usual. Meetings had run longer than expected, and by the time he made it to Catherine's room, she was already asleep. Sophia was curled up in the chair beside her bed, a book resting on her lap. She looked up as he entered, watching him carefully. "You're late today," she said, not accusingly, just stating a fact. Alexander nodded, stepping further into the room. "I had some work to finish. But I told you I'd be here, didn't I?" Sophia considered that for a moment before nodding. "Yeah. You did." He glanced at the book in her hands. "What are you reading?" She hesitated for a second before holding it up so he could see the cover. "It's a mystery book. Mom got it for me a while ago." Alexander pulled a chair closer and sat down. "Do you like mysteries?" Sophia shrugged. "Sometimes. I like trying to figure things out before the book tells you the answer." He smirked slightly. "That's a good skill to have. Knowing how to see the ending before it happens." She looked at him thoughtfully. "Is that how you got rich?" Alexander wasn't expecting the question, but he wasn't surprised by it either. Sophia was observant. She had probably heard things about him over the years, had likely formed her own opinions long before they ever met. "Part of it," he admitted. "I learned how to predict things, how to stay ahead. But sometimes, the best things in life aren't the ones you plan for." Sophia was silent for a moment, flipping the corner of a page absent-mindedly. "You didn't plan for me," she finally said, her voice quieter than before. The words hit him harder than he expected. He exhaled slowly, leaning forward slightly. "No," he said honestly. "I didn't. But that doesn't mean I don't want to be here now." Sophia looked down at her book, her fingers tracing over the worn edges of the cover. "I guess I just don't know what this means yet," she admitted. Alexander nodded, understanding. "That's okay. We'll figure it out." She studied him for a long moment, then slowly, she shifted in her chair, sitting up straighter. "Do you want me to tell you what the book is about?" Something in his chest eased at the question. I'd like that. Sophia nodded, opening the book again. Okay. So, there's this detective, and he gets a case that seems simple at first, but then. As she started explaining the plot, Alexander listened, watching the way her face lit up as she spoke. It was a small thing, but it felt like a step forward. And for the first time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he still had a chance to be the father she deserved. The morning of Catherine's surgery arrived sooner than Alexander had expected. He had spent the past week ensuring that every possible precaution had been taken, that the best surgeons were on her case, and that Sophia would be taken care of no matter what happened. But despite all his planning, despite his relentless need for control, there was one thing he couldn't change, the uncertainty that came with waiting. He arrived at the hospital before dawn, stepping into Catherine's room just as the nurses were preparing her for the procedure. She looked up at him with tired eyes, but there was something softer in her expression than there had been before. Over the past week, she had slowly begun to accept his presence, no longer treating his involvement as something temporary. "You're here early," she murmured, her voice slightly hoarse. "I wasn't going to let you go into this alone," he said, moving closer to the bed. "Sophia's still asleep. I made sure she was comfortable before I came in." Catherine exhaled, her lips curving into a faint smile. "She told me you stayed late last night. She likes having you around." Alexander wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had spent years avoiding any kind of emotional entanglement, but hearing that Sophia had grown comfortable with him did something unexpected to his chest. "She's a good kid," he finally said. "Strong. Just like you." Catherine's gaze softened. "She's had to be." There was a weight behind those words that he didn't miss. He had only known Sophia for a short time, but he had already seen glimpses of the burden she carried. She had grown up without a father, watching her mother struggle in silence, and yet she had been the one to take action when things got worse. That kind of strength wasn't something a child should have to develop so young. Alexander sat down in the chair beside the bed, his fingers lacing together as he looked at her. "No more doing this alone," he said firmly. "That ends today." Catherine let out a breath, something unspoken passing between them. "I still don't know what this looks like, Alex. Us. You, me, and Sophia. We don't have to know everything right now," he said. "But I do know one thing. I'm not walking away." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Okay." A nurse entered then, interrupting the moment. "Ms. Brooks, it's time to take you down to pre-op." Catherine glanced at Alexander once more before shifting to sit up. He instinctively reached out, steadying her when she wobbled slightly. The touch was brief but grounding, a reminder of the history they shared. As the nurses helped her onto the stretcher, she looked up at him. "Take care of her while I'm in there." "You don't even have to ask," he said. She nodded, then allowed the nurses to wheel her out of the room. Alexander stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where she had been, then took a deep breath before turning to leave. When he reached the waiting room, Sophia was already there, sitting in one of the chairs with her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up as he approached, her blue eyes filled with unspoken worry. "Is she gone?" she asked. "They just took her in," he said, lowering himself into the chair beside her. Sophia stared down at the floor, fidgeting with the hem of her sweatshirt. "She said she'd be okay, but, what if something goes wrong?" Alexander wasn't used to comforting people. He had spent his entire life focused on results, on logic, on numbers, and business deals. But this wasn't something he could fix with money or power. This was his daughter, and she was scared. He reached out, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. "She's in good hands. The best doctors are with her. And no matter what happens, we'll get through it. Together." Sophia looked up at him, searching his face for something. After a moment, she exhaled and nodded. "Okay. They sat there in silence for a while, the hospital's fluorescent lights casting a dull glow over the room. For the first time in a long time, Alexander found himself in a situation where he wasn't in control. And yet, as he sat beside his daughter, waiting for news of Catherine, he realized something. Maybe some things weren't meant to be controlled. Maybe some things were just meant to be felt. The waiting felt endless. Time stretched in a way Alexander wasn't used to, every minute ticking by slower than the last. He had spent years making quick decisions, calculating outcomes, and controlling every variable in his life. But here, in this sterile waiting room, there was nothing to control. The fate of someone who had once meant everything to him, someone who still did, was out of his hands. Sophia sat beside him, silent but tense. She hadn't spoken much since Catherine had been taken into surgery, and Alexander hadn't pushed her. He could tell she was trying to hold herself together, but every so often, she would shift in her chair, hugging her knees tighter or playing with the sleeves of her sweatshirt, clear signs of the nerve she was trying to suppress. A nurse walked by, and Sophia's head snapped up, her eyes wide with anticipation, but the woman kept moving. He could see the flicker of disappointment cross her face before she quickly masked it. "She's going to be okay," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Sophia didn't look at him right away. Instead, she stared down at her sneakers, kicking them lightly against the chair's leg. "You don't know that," she murmured. Alexander exhaled. "No, I don't. But I do know that she's strong. And she has people fighting for her." Sophia glanced up at him then, studying him like she was still trying to figure him out. "Did you ever think about her after you left?" The question caught him off guard, though maybe it shouldn't have. He shifted slightly, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I did," he admitted. "More than I let myself say out loud. There were times I thought about reaching out, but I convinced myself she had moved on. That she didn't need me anymore." Sophia frowned. "She never stopped needing you," she said, and there was no anger in her voice, just quiet sadness. "She just didn't want to get in your way." The weight of that truth settled over him, heavier than he expected. Catherine had always been independent, but he hadn't realized just how much she had sacrificed for his sake. "I should have been there," he said after a long pause. Sophia hesitated, then sighed. "You're here now," she said, as if that was enough for the moment. Alexander glanced at her again, seeing a depth in her that went beyond her years. She had been forced to grow up faster than she should have, carrying responsibilities no child should have to bear. And now, in the middle of this uncertainty, she was showing more resilience than some adults he knew. "You remind me of her," he said, and for the first time, he saw the hint of a smile tug at the corner of her lips. Before either of them could say anything else, the door to the surgical wing opened, and a doctor stepped out. Sophia shot to her feet, and Alexander followed, his heart pounding in a way that was entirely unfamiliar to him. The doctor gave them a reassuring nod before speaking. "The surgery was successful. Catherine is stable, and she's being moved to recovery now. She'll be groggy for a while, but everything went as planned." Sophia let out a shaky breath, her shoulders visibly relaxing. "Can we see her?" The doctor hesitated. "She needs some time to wake up fully, but one of you can go in first. Just for a few minutes." Sophia immediately turned to Alexander, her expression determined. "You go." He blinked at her, momentarily thrown off. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Yeah. I'll go in after." For a moment, he could only stare at her, surprised by how selfless she was, by how much she had already learned to put others before herself. He gave her a small nod before turning to follow the doctor down the hall. The beeping of the monitors was the first thing he noticed when he stepped into the room. Catherine looked fragile, paler than he had ever seen her, but she was breathing steadily. He moved closer, hesitating for a moment before sitting down in the chair beside her bed. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but he spoke anyway. You scared the hell out of me, he murmured. But you made it through. Her eyelashes fluttered slightly, and after a moment, her eyes opened just enough to see him. Alex? Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. I'm here, he said, leaning forward. Everything went well. The doctor said you'll be okay. She gave him a weak smile, her hand twitching slightly against the sheets. Without thinking, he reached out, covering her fingers with his own. You stayed, she murmured. He tightened his grip slightly. Of course, I did. She let out a slow breath, her eyes drifting closed again, but the faintest smile remained on her lips. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt something shift inside him, something real, something that had nothing to do with business or power. Something that felt like home. Catherine's recovery was slow but steady. The doctors were optimistic about her progress, and within a few days, she was able to sit up and hold longer conversations without struggling for breath. Alexander had made sure she had everything she needed, from private nurses to round-the-clock care, and he didn't leave the hospital unless it was absolutely necessary. Sophia had been her mother's constant companion, but she had also started to warm up to Alexander in ways he hadn't expected. At first, their conversations had been brief and careful, as if she was still trying to decide if she could trust him. But over time, she had started to talk to him more, ask him questions, and even include him in small moments that had once belonged only to her and Catherine. One afternoon, Alexander arrived at the hospital to find Sophia sitting beside her mother's bed, quietly reading aloud from a book. Catherine was half awake, listening with a small smile, and when she noticed Alexander standing in the doorway, she gave him a tired but warm look. You're just in time for the best part, Catherine murmured. Sophia glanced up at him, then hesitated before holding the book out. Do you want to read the next page? The offer caught him off guard, but he took the book without hesitation and settled into the chair beside Catherine's bed. Sophia scooted over to make room for him, watching as he found the place where she had left off. He wasn't used to this, wasn't used to soft moments or quiet gestures, but he wanted to learn. As he read aloud, he could feel both Catherine and Sophia relaxing beside him. The hospital room, which had once felt cold and clinical, now felt almost warm, filled with something he hadn't realized he was missing. Later that evening, when Catherine had drifted off to sleep, Alexander found himself outside the hospital with Sophia, who had insisted on getting some fresh air. They sat on a bench near the entrance, the cool evening breeze wrapping around them. Sophia kicked at a pebble on the ground, her expression thoughtful. You know, I used to make up stories about you, she said after a moment. Alexander turned to look at her, surprised. What kind of stories? She shrugged. Sometimes you were a secret agent. Sometimes a famous explorer. Once, I even imagined you were a prince who had to go on a mission to save a kingdom. He smirked. I think I like the explorer version best. Sophia gave a small smile, then looked down at her hands. I used to wonder why you weren't here. But now, I think I get it. Mom said you were building something important, and I guess I understand why she didn't tell you. Alexander exhaled, leaning forward slightly. I wish she had. Sophia nodded. Me too. He hesitated, then looked at her seriously. But I need you to know something. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. She studied him for a long moment, as if searching for any sign that he might change his mind. Then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, she said. It was a simple word, but to Alexander, it meant everything. A week later, Catherine was discharged from the hospital. She was still weak, still in need of rest, but she was finally able to go home. Alexander had made arrangements for her to recover somewhere comfortable, a quiet estate outside the city where she wouldn't have to worry about anything. At first, she had protested, insisting she didn't want to be a burden, but he had shut that argument down immediately. You're not a burden, he had told her. You never were. Now, as he helped her settle onto the couch in the sunlit living room of the house, she sighed in contentment. Sophia curled up beside her, and for the first time in a long time, they both looked at peace. Catherine glanced at Alexander, her expression unreadable. "You really did all of this?" He nodded. "Of course." She smiled softly. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," he said simply. "Just focus on getting better." She studied him for a long moment, then reached out, resting her hand over his. It was a small gesture, but it held years of unspoken words, of things they had never said. Sophia, watching the exchange, finally spoke up. "So, what happens now?" Alexander looked at her, then at Catherine, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to have a perfectly planned answer. "Now," he said, "we figure it out. Together." Catherine smiled, and Sophia gave a small nod, as if deciding she was okay with that answer. And as Alexander sat there, surrounded by the family he never knew he had, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about the future or the past. He was just here, in this moment, exactly where he was meant to be. The ending of this story is powerful not because it ties everything up neatly with a perfect resolution, but because it embraces the reality of rebuilding relationships. Alexander Rivers starts as a man who believes he has everything, power, wealth, and control, but through the unexpected revelation of his daughter and the return of Catherine, he realizes that true success isn't measured by what he has built, but by the people he chooses to hold close. What makes the conclusion so satisfying is that it doesn't rush the emotional journey. Alexander doesn't suddenly become the perfect father overnight, nor does Sophia immediately trust him without hesitation. There is still uncertainty, still wounds that need healing, but the key difference is that they're no longer facing it alone. The story acknowledges that repairing lost time isn't about grand gestures, but about showing up, proving through actions rather than words that he is here to stay. Catherine's acceptance of his help is another significant moment. She spent years believing she had to handle everything on her own, afraid that asking for support would be seen as a weakness. But by the end, she allows herself to lean on Alexander, not because she has no other choice, but because she finally sees that he's sincere. Her quiet strength, combined with her willingness to let him in, makes their reunion feel authentic rather than forced. Sophia, as the heart of this story, represents both the pain of lost time and the hope of second chances. Her cautious approach to Alexander is entirely realistic. She doesn't fully trust him at first, and why would she? He's a stranger who was absent for most of her life. But the moment she starts opening up, sharing small moments with him, it's clear that she wants to believe in him. And when she finally accepts him as her father, it's not because he's promised her the world, but because he's proven he's not going to walk away. The most beautiful part of this ending is that it doesn't rely on dramatic declarations or forced resolutions. Instead, it focuses on the simple but profound truth that family isn't about perfection. It's about choosing to be there, to fight for one another, to show up even when things aren't easy. Alexander doesn't just gain a daughter, he gains a new purpose, a reason to redefine what matters most. The final scene, where he admits he doesn't have all the answers but is willing to figure it out together, is the perfect way to close this chapter of his life. It acknowledges the uncertainty of the future while reinforcing the one thing that truly matters: he is no longer facing it alone. And that, more than anything, is what makes this story not just moving, but deeply meaningful.